This is our final chapter of content to get you guys ready for the AP test. So this is chapter 18, Conservation of Biodiversity. Last week we took a look at the importance of biodiversity. We looked at ecosystem diversity, species diversity with species richness. We looked at genetic biodiversity. In this chapter focuses on the threats to biodiversity and what we can do to try to fix that. So one thing to realize is that extinctions are actually a pretty normal event to occur. Now, if you think about all the species that have ever existed on the planet, 98 to 99.9% of all species that ever existed are currently extinct. We have gone through major mass extinctions in geologic history. In fact, there are 5 major documented mass extinctions. One of them you know quite well is the one that killed off all the dinosaurs. So some of them are physical changes. One of the first ones was the advent of oxygen that made the atmosphere toxic to the species that were present before. So there have been different reasons for these mass extinctions. Now, a lot of signs are pointing to the fact that we might currently be in the middle of our 6th great extinction, our 6th mass extinction. Now, the difference between a mass extinction and a background extinction is that a mass extinction is when many species go extinct within a short period of time. It is actually pretty normal to have background extinctions going on due to competition, where some will become extinct due to competition, so 1 or 2 species at a time might go extinct. Now, the extinction rate is currently 100 to 1,000 times higher than before humans were around, and that equates to about 50,000 species a year going extinct, and that is directly tied to some of the threats to biodiversity that we'll talk about in this presentation. Now, the picture to the right there shows you areas that are hotspots of biodiversity problems. So all the red dots are areas that are unprotected, that do have a problem with extinction going on right now and a loss of biodiversity. And the green areas are areas that we're currently trying to protect in one way or another. So you can see over in Hawaii that there is a big national marine preserve there now. So we're doing our best to try to preserve the biodiversity there. Now, we mentioned the importance of genetic diversity in the last presentation. The reason why genetic diversity, again, is important is because it allows a population to be able to withstand changes in the environment, maybe disease or changes in temperature, because if there is that bell-shaped curve of characteristics within a population, there might be a small percentage of the species that can handle any type of changes that are occurring, and they at least would be able to survive and pass on that trait to future generations, preserving the species as a whole. So genetic diversity is key, and to have genetic diversity, you need a decent sized population. Now, we have levels of risk for species. Endangered is much worse than being threatened. If you are a threatened species, then you are at risk of becoming endangered. If you're an endangered species, you're at risk of becoming extinct. Now, there are different characteristics that make you more vulnerable to becoming threatened or endangered. One of the first ones is if you're big. If you're big, you need a lot of habitat, and that was one of the key things that we're losing as humans are developing more and more natural areas. So if you're big, you need a lot of habitat, and humans are taking away that habitat, so that itself puts you at risk of becoming extinct. If you're slow, because a lot of the threats to biodiversity are for hunting, so if you're slow, then you are more likely to be able to be captured either by a predator or by a human. If you're a specialist, remember that those specialists have a very narrow range of tolerance for changes in the environment. So if you are a specialist, you are more at risk of becoming endangered. If you're marketable, if you have a fur or a body part that is something that is desirable by people that they can sell, then that makes you more vulnerable to extinction. If you are archaea selected, and have that low reproductive rate, that makes you very vulnerable because you can't regrow your population. For instance, animals that have a gestation period of 2 to 3 years in some cases, if you can only have a baby every 3 years, then your population isn't going to grow fast. So that is in direct contrast to our R-selected that, remember, have that very high reproductive rate. And then finally, if you're a top predator, you're at risk of becoming extinct because you tend to be big, you tend to need a lot of habitat, and you are more directly tied to problems below you on the food chain. You're more vulnerable to biomagnification. So a top predator has a lot of issues that may pop up. So I'm going to use an acronym to help us remember our threats to biodiversity, and that acronym is HIPPO. So I picked some pretty hippo pictures here for you to try to remember this by. So H is for habitat destruction. That is our first and primary way that we are losing our biodiversity. Second is invasive species. And then pollution, population growth, and overharvesting. Those three all kind of go together because those are all directly tied to that population growth. So we'll go through these 5 in order. So the first one is our habitat loss. Now, habitat loss can be completely annihilating a habitat, like you can see that picture on the left of that forest, that tropical rainforest that we're clearing to plant palm oil plantations. So this is just one example of a reason for biodiversity. But palm oil is a product that's in a lot of materials now, and a lot of tropical rainforest has been completely deforested to make space for these palm plantations. And so one animal that is greatly impacted by that is the orangutan up there in the tree, that they're completely losing their habitat. Now, other areas, kind of like what we talked about in our last presentation, is even fragmentation can be poor. So you can see in the picture on the right that we have one habitat, and if we split it into 2 different habitats, you might not have a great loss in habitat space, but because you no longer have one continuous habitat, you're going to lose some of those top predators. So that really inhibits our larger animals from being able to live there because they need a large continuous habitat. So both complete habitat loss as well as fragmentation are both issues with habitat loss. And then just another reminder that it tends to be our specialists that are more targeted by habitat loss, because if they lose their bamboo forest or their eucalyptus trees, then they won't be able to adapt to a new food source. So habitat loss is one of our biggest problems with respect to biodiversity. Now, invasive or alien species, these are species that are introduced to a new environment. Now, sometimes that introduction can be on purpose. There have been times when we have purposely brought animals in and introduced them to a new area. One example of this is a cane toad. It is a rather large but venomous toad or poisonous toad that we introduced to Australia to try to control their grub population. And as it turned out, it did not do the job. And they had no predators in Australia and really have completely taken over Australia. So there are cane toads everywhere. So sometimes they're on purpose. Other times it's unintentional. That picture up in the right corner here, this shows a population of zebra mussels that have filled up an intake pipe into one of the Great Lakes. So zebra mussels were an accidental introduction into the Great Lakes, and because they have no predators, they have completely taken over. They're good competitors, they're generalists, and they have found a habitat that they are better competitors in than the natural shellfish. So with the zebra mussels, what happened is that was an introduction through boats. A lot of times boats will take on water in one area to change the way they sit in the water column and release that water in another area. And when they do, they'll release small larvae of fish or shellfish. So the key thing about introduced species. If it's an alien species, it may not be causing harm, but if we refer to it as an invasive species, then we are implying that it is causing harm in that area and outcompeting some natural species. So you can see that the pictures of the plants, this is actually kudzu. So kudzu is something that we have introduced into the South to help with erosion control. But our animals here do not like to eat kudzu, and so it has no natural predators, and it really has taken over. And there's a saying that is called the vine that ate the South. So you can see here in the winter picture an area with not a lot of plants, and in the spring the kudzu is starting to grow. By midsummer, it's covering the house, and by early fall, it's just everywhere. Another invasive species that gets a lot of attention in this area is the snakehead. And this is a picture of the snakehead right here. And the snakehead is actually in Lake Braddock. They are an invasive species. This one comes from Asia, and we don't quite know how it got situated in this area. There's a few stories of its origination, but it is a great predator. It's a voracious predator, and one of the key things about this guy is he can actually use his pectoral fins to walk on land a short distance, so he can go from one lake to another in search of food. Now, population growth, pollution, and over-harvesting I put all together with our population growth, because this really is tied to our growing human population, that we're hunting too much, we're over-harvesting for things like pet trade or for food or for medicinal purposes. Our pollution is leading to climate change on a very rapid pace, and all the pollution that we're putting out there and pesticides are harming our animals, going through biomagnification and creating a lot of problems. Now, what we're doing to protect this is one big thing we can do is legislate. We can create laws. The ESA, or the Endangered Species Act, it identifies and protects endangered animals, and the key thing here is that it also protects their habitats. You can't do anything to an endangered species habitat. So our Endangered Species Act has really done a lot of good to help promote the protection of our endangered species here in the United States. Now, CITES is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. This is an international agreement that makes it illegal to trade or to buy parts of endangered species that have been recognized internationally. So it doesn't really necessarily prevent you from harming them, but it does prevent you from profiting from it. So these are two laws that you do need to know for the test. These are specifically listed. And then finally, what we do to try to help preserve these areas is really take a look at the habitat of these endangered or threatened species. So we take a look at the core area that they live in and realize that we need to have layers of protection to separate the animal from the human interaction. So a biosphere reserve starts with a core area where that animal is able to live without interaction with humans. And then you have a buffer zone surrounding that might have some research facilities or maybe some ecotourism. And then finally on the outside you allow some human interaction in. So you have a buffer zone between the core animal habitat and the human interaction, because our habitat is the key thing that we have to protect for these species. So these are the best ways that we're currently trying to save our biodiversity, by creating these biosphere reserves to protect their habitat and legislating to make sure that the animals and their habitats are both protected. So please take a look, make sure you answer the questions below, and also make sure you ask any questions of things that just wasn't clear in this presentation.